Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Thursday, April 18th today, and this is a report on the full moon in Libra. So this was an obvious choice in terms of an astrological transit to report on because it's a big full moon coming right on the heels of a number of very powerful astrological transits this month. And I just felt like it was time to do a live cast anyway, because my inbox has been flooded with a lot of commentary about recent events in the news, including the fire at Notre Dame and the general energy surrounding the Sun square Pluto dynamic that just unfolded, which was, I think a lot of people experienced it as very potent. So I thought, this full moon has the buildup for this full moon has been so strong, so we might as well take a look at what's going on. I want to recap some of the transits that have been happening recently, how you can think about some of them. I'll mention some current events, but as usual, every time that I mention current events, somebody inevitably says, well, what about this? Or what about that? Aren't there more events that could be related to this? Why are you leaving out this one or that one? And so I want to say in advance that it's out of my own ignorance of current events, not because I have any vested interest in one event or another. I see most of the news that I see is just whatever's on social media, because that's where anything that I do online is almost 90% based in the social media posting and that I do for astrology and following it. And then I check into the news usually once a day, very briefly. So for that, I can only say that, like, for example, someone mentioned that there was another temple, a mosque that burned in Jerusalem or something like that. Another example of the same archetypal dynamic. Why only talk about Notre Dame? So again, my response is only that I, like many people, I see whatever is trending in the social media feeds, and my personal practice is not so engaged in the mundane or collective unfolding of events. I'm always shaping my horoscopes in terms of thinking about the individual who's reading and what they might be going through personally. It's not as much my focus to think about current events. Sometimes I tap into them, but it's admittedly selective. So I say that in advance because inevitably after every time that I do one of these types of broadcasts and talk about some current events related to the astrology, people will always be like, well, why not? Why didn't you include this other thing or whatever? So at any rate, that being said, let's back up and talk about what's been happening lately. There's been some really big events. The number one event that unfolded over the course of last weekend was the square from Pluto to the Sun, which was powerful because the Sun was making the square to Pluto, Saturn in the South Node at a point that's called the South Bending. I won't go into a full discussion of what the bending points are, but I'll just give you a little synopsis. The bending points are the 90-degree points between the nodes of the moon. So you have the nodes of the moon are always exactly opposite one another in the zodiac. So for example, right now, the node, south node is about 22 Capricorn, the north node's like 22 Cancer. So the bendings are going to be 22 Libra and 22 Aries. So that's basically how you get an idea of where they are. They're the 90-degree points on either side of the nodes. Now those 2 points, one of them is called the south bending and the other is called the north bending. And there's a way that astrologers calculate this. When the Sun is at roughly 22 degrees Aries, right around there right now, as it just passed through that degree, it's at the south bending, which typically means that there are events that are going to be flavored by the square to the node of the moon and any planets circulating or any planets, I should say, situated near the south node of the moon, in this case, both Saturn and Pluto. And the square will activate the potency of the south node of the moon. So it had a very intense south node kind of feeling. Well, what is the south node? Well, some ancient astrologers compared the south node to Saturn. Saturn as a planet that's related to decline, diminishment, and loss, and also, in some sense, detachment. So, for example, if you fast, go on a juice cleanse for a day or something like that, the next day you might notice that you're not as ravenously hungry. You need a smaller portion size when you sit down to eat because maybe your stomach's gotten a little smaller, or you've just entrained your body a little bit to not needing as much food. This is a kind of south node meaning in the positive sense. Detachment, shedding the layers, letting go of things that are unnecessary, kind of trimming down to what's only necessary. Those are some of the positive meanings of Saturn in general, as well as the south node. Focus, concentration, discipline, a certain degree of austerity, even to a certain extent, even dedication. Saturn's not necessarily usually the one to generate the mood of love and devotion like that, but dedication in terms of I'll stick to my process, I'll stick to my practice, like that. So there are some beneficial elements of the south node for sure. And also the south node in a general sense can relate, some people will relate it to the past. And one of the reasons that we relate it to the past is because this tends to be the point at which the lunar cycle, in a sense, is going from a place of gain to a place of diminishment. And the association of diminishment with the past is typically because, the way that I have thought about this at any rate, is that when you're moving through time and you're a creature of desire, you are a self that has needs and wants, you are typically moving from a space of what I have right now is no longer satisfying me, and so I'm thinking about what I desire in the future. So insofar as desire is related to the future, the North Node and desire have a lot in common. That's also why the North Node is related to Jupiter in ancient astrology, and the sense of gain and appetite. But as there is a natural, after you fill yourself up with something, then gradually you sort of digest the experience and it's no longer satisfying. So that feeling of something being done, of the pleasure having been diminished, of there having been loss or disappointment or this dissatisfaction, that's related to the South Node. And so we have this process in time where we're always taking things in, digesting them, not liking them any longer, needing something new, and like that. So the South Node can also have to do with the past insofar as we're sometimes revisiting things with the South Node that have to do with digested experiences from the past that crystallize into wisdom or insight. In that sense, I tend to agree with what some evolutionary astrologers say about the South Node having something to do with the soul's accumulated wisdom from the past. That's certainly a possibility. And so when you see the sun crossing the south bending recently and squaring Saturn and Pluto in the South Node all together, any of those transits alone, a Saturn square Sun or a Sun square Saturn transit or a Sun square Pluto transit, are powerful. But when you put it all together and at the south bending, squaring the South Node, it just generated an incredibly potent series of events for a lot of people personally, and we could see it in the news as well. Add to this that as that was happening, we also had a couple of other things happening, like Mercury was squaring Jupiter. Venus was squaring Jupiter, adding some grandiosity and some flair into the situation, and a general feeling of beauty and sort of auspiciousness, and a sense of the possibility of resurrection or redemption in the midst of a time that could otherwise be defined as a pretty intense and deep encounter with inevitability, with fate, with death, with limitation, with constriction, with having to fight or sort of muscle your way through a feeling of blockage. So it was a very dynamic time that we experienced last weekend. You could see this, for example, and so as this was happening, the moon moved through Leo and also created a grand fire trine over last weekend. One of the things that we saw, for example, that I wrote about that was really impressive was in the professional sports world, the famous golfer Tiger Woods had this comeback win at the Masters tournament. This was something that I'm not, I don't watch sports that often any longer. I used to be a pretty big sports fanatic. But you could see as the weekend was developing and this grand fire trine was forming with, Sun at the south bending and with Venus squaring Jupiter and Mercury squaring Jupiter. You could just feel that there was something, some kind of blockage was being worked through. Something from the past was being dealt with. And it just had the feeling of something being released or freed up through a process of constraint and deep constriction. And that was exactly how Tiger Woods described the process of winning the Masters tournament, which was a big deal because he's one of the greatest golfers of all time, but his life had really fallen apart over the course of 11 years, both personal scandals, deep-seated psychological issues, personal scandals, and then really intense health problems kind of plagued him. And he went from being sort of a sports icon to like this really tragic, like kind of story of someone falling down. And so the reason that this was unique was because he had had a spinal fusion surgery in his back and sort of come back in this amazing way. And then over the course of the weekend, the way in which he won was also unique because in his career, he had never come from behind to win a major tournament. And so there was this feeling of having to overcome in the circumstances in which he won the event. There was the feeling of him like grinding through the past and sort of coming from behind to win. So this was a real heroic Aries squaring the south bending of Saturn, Pluto, and the south node, like heroically burning through something from the past. And then that grand fire trine, especially with the trine to Jupiter, which had just turned retrograde, sort of this feeling of redemption from the past and a turnaround. Retrogrades represent reversals, so a turnaround. And this feeling of having kind of risen out of the ashes, right? So there was this, again, it had a very Phoenix kind of feeling all around it. And it was very beautiful to watch. The announcers were actually mentioning astrological things. Like one of the announcers, he was very serious too, because he was so just enamored by what was happening. And I had the chance to tune into the last part of it while I was on daddy duty. So I turned it on to see, because it was, again, Facebook feed, people are talking about it. I turn on my phone app and look and see what's happening. And oh God, he could win. Turn on to see what's happening and watch the last part of it. And it was really amazing. The announcer is sitting there talking about sunspot cycles, or the magnetic turning of the sun, or I don't remember what he was saying exactly, but and he said, does this mean that the sun of golf has returned? And I was like, that he doesn't know it, but he's talking about the sun square Pluto at the south bending. He's talking about the sort of heroic encounter with a dark limitation from the past. He's talking about resurrection, Sun trine, Jupiter retrograde in Sagittarius. He's talking about the will to persist and the staying power to succeed, grand fire trine with the Sun in Aries, square Pluto and Saturn in Capricorn. I had written about these things too, about spiritual staying power, about studying people who had worked through adversity and kind of sticking with something. These were things that I had been writing about in anticipation of these transits. And so it was really actually very beautiful to see it play out in such a vivid story in the news. Now, the other thing that ended up coming right out of that grand fire trine, which was also kind of amazing, was in the process of the resurrection of Notre Dame, this cathedral that's very famous and old and being rebuilt in Paris. Of course, the cathedral burned. It was, there was a fire that came through. And yet out of this fire came the contribution of like tons and tons of money. And interestingly, that site was formerly, it was built on a temple that was formerly dedicated to Jupiter. So there's this feeling of an encounter with sort of demons from the past. It's a serious thing in the spiritual sense to build a temple on top of the temple dedicated to a different god. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something that felt very karmic. There was a feeling of karmic retribution, but there was also this feeling of kind of this process of resurrection. And I had been told that the money that was going into rebuilding Notre Dame or doing some element of rehabilitation or restoration or something like that was also rather complicated in nature. I don't really know much about this at all, but I had heard that there was a somewhat complicated background with this. And then, of course, it's also there's a feeling of I've seen a lot of people asking questions. Why is it that billions and billions are instantly poured into the restoration of an architectural site, and we don't have that same response to trying to deal with basic problems that our fellow human beings are dealing with every day? So what this feeling of something being torn down and built back up. But also, there were questions in the mix about morality. There was an article that came out right after Tiger Woods won, and it was such a good article, and it was talking about how redemption in a sport like golf is not necessarily the same as personal, moral, spiritual, or psychological redemption. So that as people, when we're consuming this, we all feel like, oh, Tiger Woods, what a hero. He rose above all those personal difficulties and won a golf tournament. But his ability to win a golf tournament is not equal to his ability to rise above all of the personal scandals that fell upon his shoulders. And that's also really important because there's this sense of celebrating a victory, having risen above some challenge, but also there are different ways that we calculate victory in the world. Sometimes, for example, you drain your bank account and then you get a check in the mail and you're like, oh, you suddenly think, I've just risen above that difficulty. How fortunate I am. That thing could have really knocked me down. And instead of studying the impulsive choices that we might have made that led to draining our bank account, we just see ourselves as, heroes who have conquered the difficulty because we got a check in the mail, and now that problem that we were dealing with can go away because our bank account is full again. Do you see what I'm saying? So similarly, we have to be really careful because we're in the wake of a moment where there's this feeling of kind of being hit by something, and like, oh my God. But also this feeling of trying to rise above and kind of resurrect out of the ashes. We just have to make sure that resurrection is of the spirit, not in a true sense, is of the spirit, not of the form. Which means when a form falls, when a material thing is done in or doesn't work or falls down or is broken, the thing that we're supposed to take away from that typically is a spiritual message, a spiritual lesson. And so when we're being resurrected, the form, getting back to where we were with the form is really not the point. Getting billions of dollars poured in so that now we can rebuild Notre Dame is really not the point. We're not savoring the defeat long enough. there is nectar in the defeat if we can stick with it. And that's where the actual spiritual potency of resurrection comes from. We have to be able to stay with, on some level, the humiliation. We have to be able to stay with the humbling power that leveled something. Because, again, this was a mixed transit. You had Mercury and Venus squaring Jupiter, Venus exalted. There's a mixture of like really getting hit or clobbered by something, but then kind of heroically rising up and receiving some simultaneous good fortune that could help us press through, and like that. So it's just very important that in this process that we don't get high on having conquered the difficulty, even if we have on some level been able to rise above challenges, even if there's been a spirit of hope and faith that's come through. It's just really, really important that we not jump directly into the next thing, because the way that we start something new on the heels of a great defeat will often be exactly the way that we start something new upon the heels of a great defeat will lead to whether or not the same exact kind of defeat comes in the future. For example, I can give you one other story. One time, I'm getting ready to spread I had a dog that died a few years ago, and I'm getting ready to spread his ashes. We've had them for a while, and I've been meaning to take some time to spread them, and then life just happened, and so I'm finally taking the time to consciously go and spread his ashes. And he died on the train tracks not far from my house. And not long after he died, I had this sense of having learned a lot about being a dog owner. There were some ways in which I felt very culpable, and he was an escape artist, so that was on him. But there were things that I could have done a better job with, and I felt so convicted about them. So because I was feeling the high of having learned something when he died, do you know what I mean? When you learn something and it's really, really powerful, and you see the truth and you're like, wow, and you know what you need to do. You have to go and act. You have to go, life kind of has a way of smacking us around sometimes, and then we're, a lot of the times not long after, if you're a reflective person, you're like, wow, thank you, that was amazing, I'm so thankful for that. And then like, oh, and now I have some homework, I have to go do this homework, and I got to go do it now. You know what I mean? But we have to be very careful about the immediacy, the impulse to immediately try to flip the script and start over and resurrect. We're so hungry for the phoenix, we neglect the ash. You know what I mean? And we need to sit with the ashes a little bit more. In fact, I'm thinking about, in India, the Shaivites, they cover themselves in ash, and the ash comes from the fire, and the fire is related to the power of the sun. And so this idea of the ash being something that is directly correlated to sunlight, that when you're covering your body in ash, you're covering your body in like sort of solidified fire or light. And to really sit in, to really have an understanding of light that's very deep, one must also be sort of covered in ash. And this is, as I understand it, at any rate, this is something of the role that Shiva plays in the alchemy of the soul as it's progressing along its path of devotion with the divine. At any rate, I won't go into that because that's a big conversation. But when I wanted to, speaking of ashes, right? When I wanted to immediately sort of memorialize and I wanted the resurrection. I wanted the juice, the nectar of immortality is so sweet. When you have a resurrection moment, there's such life, there's such regenerative force. This is Pluto as well, that we get high on it. And then immediately the choices we make to resurrect, because we haven't sat in the ash long enough, they become impulsive, they become reckless, they become drunk on the exact same kinds of things that may have led to our downfall in the first place. And so we have to be very careful about that pivotal time of of transition when something burns in our life. So I went out and very quickly bought another dog because I thought, I'm going to redeem myself. I have the energy, I have the insight, I have the knowledge to be a better dog owner, and I need to do that, right? Because I had felt so high on having learned these important lessons through this very deep cathartic death of my dog. So I went out and got another dog in like 2 months. And that dog was just way more than we could handle. It was a big Newfoundland. And I was really excited about it. And I was just like, because I was high on this idea of resurrecting. And of course, within a year, we found that it was way too much dog for us. And so I had to find it an adopted home. It's now living with 2 other Newfoundlands on a lot of land. So it's got a very good home. He has a very nice home, but I had to find him a new home through a Newfoundland rehoming agency. And I'll just never forget feeling like, when that high comes, it's very important to just kind of check in and not rush off too quickly to try to enjoy and capitalize on the power of regeneration. You can see this in the news too. As soon as Tiger Woods won, within less than 24 hours, the headlines in the sports world read, how many more will he win? Will he surpass Jack Nicklaus? And it's at just such a moment that I feel personally that Tiger and everyone would be wise to just take a little bit of the metaphorical ashes of his story and rub them on our bodies. And also remember that just because you won a sports event, just because there's some victory in the midst of loss on a material level, does not mean that there has been a spiritual redemption. Just because Notre Dame will be rebuilt does not mean that people will necessarily learn the lessons of seeing it burn. These are important distinctions to make right now. So I hope that these thoughts can translate for you into your own lives. Now, coming out of all of that, we're heading towards a full moon in Libra. Now, the full moon in Libra has a few things to offer us. First of all, I want to say a few things about the full moon itself. So what makes this full moon unique is that, here we go. There we are. So this full moon is pretty unique because it's happening at anaretic degrees, which means that the moon is at 29 Libra while the sun is at 29 Aries. So those anaretic degrees are pretty intense. The other thing that makes this pretty intense is that the sun is just 3 degrees off from moving into an engagement with Uranus. So this is a very powerful full moon because it actually has a lot of Uranian energy coming through it. Hours after the full moon opposes the sun to make the full moon, it will hit the opposition to Uranus. Within a few days, the sun will conjoin Uranus. So between now and about the 23rd of the month, this Uranian energy is going to really tone the full moon. Big deal. And then on top of it, you're also seeing Mercury after like 6 weeks of having been in the nebulous ethers, nebulous waters of Pisces, and where it's also badly debilitated in traditional terms. It's a challenging place for Mercury. Now Mercury has moved into Aries, where it is, now in a mutual reception with Mars, who is in Gemini, which is Mercury's sign. So Mercury is in Aries, which is Mars's sign, and Mars is in Gemini, which is Mercury's sign. Mercury is also in the next few days moving into a conjunction with Chiron, the wounded healer, who also recently ingressed into Aries. So let me put forth some ideas for us to think about with regard to these transits. The first one, and maybe the most important, has to do with the administration of justice. There is a feeling with the full moon in Libra about karmic consequences that level or balance the scales. And there is also So this full moon, you could say in general, has the feeling of being about a karmic balancing. Um, it would not be surprising in your own life, in my life, to notice that things are happening, that things are being leveled or balanced out somehow. If things have been on an extreme in one area of your life, in your way of thinking, in conversations with people, if you've been really one-sided about something, if you've been way too principled or intense about something, you'll receive some feedback that's going to help you swing over in the opposite direction a little bit. And sometimes that's hard. That may also require a certain kind of submissiveness on the part of the ego right now. So just that idea of a balancing, the scales have been tilted like this, just imagine them kind of going in the opposite direction right now. And do we have the patience to accept that? Because with Mercury in Aries and Mars in Gemini, that mutual reception between the two of them can very easily put us into a mentally aggressive position. And the full moon, however, is happening as Venus is culminating in Pisces, which is a feminine and more compassionate, emotional place. Now, Venus is going to enter Aries pretty soon, right? But for now, I think what we need to think about is the patience and receptivity required to learn something and to allow ourselves or our egos to be, sort of submissive enough to allow for some kind of balancing out. So in my own life, I'm reflecting on this lately in just in terms of like looking around and seeing the feedback that the environment is giving me, that my body is giving me, and that people around me are giving me. And through just listening and paying careful attention, I can feel like, okay, I'm getting some very important feedback. If I can feel that desire within me to defend, to attack, to try to protect or preserve my ego, because it's not always easy to have the scales balanced back out. We get fixed in our positions. We mistake our ideas, our thoughts, our mental pictures of things. We mistake them for our sense of safety or our sense of identity or our sense of power. And because that's what we do, when something comes along to show us the way in which we may be off base, or we may be acting in an extreme way, or we may be missing something, it's very easy to become defensive. And right now, especially like mentally and verbally. And so it's very difficult to look at the world and to see the things happening around us and to see them as messages for us in ways that we need to adjust or shift or learn or grow. It's just hard to accept that. It's very easy to, it's easier to stay in the position of, I'm an innocent person here and there's someone else to blame, but if we take the idea of blame out of it altogether, we just detach from the defensiveness of the ego and get out of the blame paradigm itself and think instead about learning, about curiosity, about receptivity and openness to what the other, whether it's the environment or other people, are telling us right now, that we can learn a lot. Now, the other thing that's coming is that this moment of karmic reckoning has the power to shake foundations. Why? Because right after this happens, the sun is going into fixed earthy Taurus, where it will conjoin with Uranus. So the ramifications of this karmic moment of balancing are bigger than we're imagining. Whatever you're looking at right now, whatever feedback you're receiving from your environment, within your relationships, however difficult it is to look at and deal with, just remember that it's probably bigger than you think it is, because the conjunction of the sun to Uranus in the next few days is going to, there's a shaking. Like, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the expression of this in the environment through an earthquake or through some natural disasters or through the earth itself kind of quaking and shaking, through literal foundations being shaken. The foundation of our life right now, the insight that we're receiving from this full moon in Libra as a balancing, as a kind of reckoning moment, we can receive it with grace, beauty, dignity, and with a certain kind of ease. There's harmonizing potential here, but it will shake the foundations. It will disturb the paradigm. It will call things into question, and pretty intensely. I would give this, like, the time frame for this, the full moon's in the next 24 hours or so, and I would extend this throughout the weekend, but up till about the 23rd in particular. So look at that as a window of time where this full moon moment and the lessons being learned will proceed to rattle the foundations on some level. Now, there's also, however, a feeling right now of with Mercury moving on to Chiron, and with the feeling of the sun having passed through the squares with Saturn and Pluto, and the south node with Saturn right now, there's still a very contractive feeling in the air. So I want to share with you the I Ching reading that I did about this next 4 or 5 days. I did it this morning because I think it's a really nice way of making sense of this process that's happening, and especially the kind of lingering feeling of Saturn in the south node still being conjoined right now, and of Mercury and Mars being in that mutual reception, and of Mercury crossing Chiron, the wounded healer, while all of this is happening. So the 21st hexagram of the I Ching is sometimes called biting through. And one of the translators writes this about it: the merciless, searing judgment of lightning fulfills the warning prophecies of distant thunder. Sage rulers preserved justice by clearly defining the laws and by delivering the penalties decreed. Though unpleasant, it is best to let justice have its due. So this hexagram is often referred to as the legal hexagram. The reason for that is that the hexagram is it has this feeling about an obstacle being caught between the teeth and having to bite through it, which has to do with constriction, law, limitations, and also judgment, which is the biting through of the object caught between the teeth. This is why we also see a picture of lightning striking the earth and coming and basically hitting something and striking it apart as a way of punishment, as a kind of a feeling of like a divine, like nature striking something apart. And this feeling of retribution or of justice is heavy in this hexagram. So you get that feeling from the full moon in Libra, given the sun culminating in Aries and the hitting Uranus right afterward, and like the Saturn in the south node in the background. So this is a moment of justice, law, retribution, punishment, etc. However, one thing that I think is very challenging about this is the line that was changing in the reading that I did was number 3. And in this line, there is the image of someone who is biting on old, dried meat, kind of a gross image. And as they're biting into a piece of old, dried meat, they strike on something poisonous, right? And then the line says that there is slight humiliation, but no blame. Okay, so this is what the translation on the translator of this line comments, and this is based on the Confucian commentary. Punishment is to be carried out by someone who lacks the power and authority to do so. Therefore, the culprits do not submit. The matter at issue is an old one, as symbolized by salted meat, old meat. And in dealing with it, difficulties arise. This old meat is spoiled. By taking up the problem, the punisher arouses poisonous hatred against himself, and in this way is put in a somewhat humiliating position. But since punishment was required by the time, he remains free of blame. Okay, that's very interesting. I want to reach for some super low-hanging fruit here and talk about the current political situation. The Mueller report comes out today. Of course it does, right? Just think about that. The Mueller report comes out today. I don't know how redacted it is or isn't or whatever, but of course, Attorney General Barr is having a spin session with the media before it comes out, right? So there's this whole like political back and forth that's going to occur about this Mueller report. But notice what this says, which is that right now there is going to be an attempt to call out and name and sort of go right at calling someone out the bad guy, like, or the bad. You could say the bad guy, the bad thing, the thing that's off center. There's Mercury in Aries, just saying, hey, that's not right. Full moon in Libra. Like, I care about justice. I'm going to say the truth. I'm going to call it out. But let's just imagine that, like, you know, you're a, I'll use this example. I was getting, frustrated the other night, and my wife and I were sort of arguing about something, and I had a bad attitude about it. And my daughter, right, who's like, 3 going on 4, was like, "That's not nice, Daddy." And I was like, in the moment, because I was so frustrated, she had no power over me. Do you know what I mean? Like, she was like Mercury and Aries calling out the bad guy. You know what I mean? And I was like, yeah, whatever, you're 3. That was my attitude. A terrible thing, because she's like very innocent. And so I was frustrated and I went upstairs. At any rate, later I said, Gigi, you were right about that. Daddy kind of had a bad attitude. So I'm sorry about that. And she was like, that's okay, Daddy. She's really, really sweet. But right now it's kind of like that situation. It's kind of like, if there's something that needs to be called out, we have the audacity, the innocence, the clear vision of a 3-year-old, there's kind of this naive feeling of truth and justice in the air. But we are dealing with an old problem. Saturn in the South Node. We're dealing with an old problem. It doesn't go away just because you call it out. It has a lot of power. You may not have the power to deal with it or eliminate it, even though you see it, even though you name it, right? So that's what this hexagram's line is all about. It's sort of like saying punishment is to be carried out by someone who lacks the power and authority to do so. So as you are biting into a piece of old meat, as you're looking at an old problem, you find, or as you're dealing with something from the past, let's say, you find something that's really problematic, right? So, for example, the Mueller report, people are going to read it. They're probably going to find things that are like really should be called out, but they're going to lack the power or ability to do so because they don't have the Senate, right? Something like that. There's no way of eliminating the problem yet. As of right now, there is no way of eliminating the problem. You're not big enough. You don't have the power, even though you can see it clearly. But how often does this happen to us in our daily lives too? One thing that my spiritual teacher says often is that you can look right at the problems you're dealing with in your life, which your spiritual practice will bring to the forefront of your mind over and over and over again, and just lack the sufficient power within yourself to eliminate it, to eliminate the problem. But the fact that you can call it out, name it, see it, say it for what it is, at the end of this line is still a positive thing. So that says you're in a somewhat humiliating position, which means you're going to be like my daughter, when she said that, and said that to me, and I ignored her. How humiliating was that for her? Do you know what I mean? How humiliating is that for a little kid to, say something that's true and stand up with some power and then have the have her father basically ignore her, so then she feels bad about herself. Well, very similarly, right now, it's probably the case that even if there is things in the report that are really bad, in the Mueller report, I'm just imagining, I don't know, that people are going to say things about it, and they're going to be probably right about what they're saying, but they're not going to have the power to do anything about it. And being in that position is humiliating on a certain level. Similarly, when we call out people for doing things that aren't right, or we call a spade, you say, hey, this isn't cool. You talk to your boss, you talk to a friend, whatever, you say, this behavior is not right. And then they're indifferent. They don't care. How humiliating is that for us? Do you know what I mean? How humiliating is it to feel like we've stood in our truth, but we can do nothing about it? But that is sometimes, again, going back to that image of not taking long enough time to be covered in ash, right? It's the same feeling. We don't really want we can't stand the humbling part of the process. We just want to get to the point where we're reborn. We just want to get to the point where the resurrection comes, the cathedral's rebuilt. He's got another championship, right? That's what we want. Similarly, when it comes to administering justice, what we want is, we want the bad guy to get his consequence. Instead of wanting justice, we want retribution. So similarly, when we face problems within ourselves, we say, oh, I have an overeating problem, or I have an overdrinking problem, or I'm, not patient enough with my daughter, or whatever the case might be. And then instantly, my dog died and I can be a better dog owner. So I want the new dog. I want to be a better dad. I want to be, I want to be in control of my diet. I want to, whatever. We want the victory, right? So when we rush for that, when we rush ahead of that and say, well, what this is really about is getting to I want to be liberated from the bad thing. But that rush toward liberation, we have to be very careful of it because it's very intimately tied to retribution. And so similarly, sometimes when we call out people who are doing bad things, I've noticed in the past couple of years that the line between calling out bad guys in social media, right, people who do bad things, and the desire to humiliate them and the desire for retribution, it's a very fine line. I see that within myself at any rate. So similarly, right now, the hexagram, speaking to the transits of the moment, is saying, look, not only may you not lack the sufficient power to make the change right now, but you have to question why. What is the virtue? What is the lesson? What is the hidden sweetness of being in a position where you don't have the power to change something, even though you know it's true, even though you have the right answer? What's the sweetness of that position? Because otherwise, again, we're not relishing the ash. We're lusting after the phoenix, and that's a problem. Is that even in spiritual life, that's a subtle problem that we're all like dealing with all the time. So when this hexagram changes in this morning's reading, when it changed, it moved into hexagram number 55, which is called abundance, or an expansion of awareness. The virtue of being in a position where we know what's wrong, we call it out, but we can't change it, is that we get to sit in the problem for a little bit longer, and we get to contemplate the way that things rise and the way that things fall. So, for example, I know this is uncomfortable, but for everything there is a season, right? And there are seasons where tyrants take the throne, and they will not be taken off the throne until their time is up. It has nothing to do with sometimes it has nothing to do with our abilities or our sense of justice or truth or our morality or our power of action. If it's not their time, if their time is not up, then it's not up. Similarly, for ourselves, sometimes, even though we know I need to, slam fewer cookies or chocolate bars, sometimes there are things that have a grip of us and their time is not up, right? We know the problem, we're looking at it, but for whatever reason, the time isn't up. It's a critical moment of transition, and it's a powerful and auspicious moment when we can call it out and say, I don't want to be slamming chocolate bars anymore, or I don't want to be like loading up on caffeine all the time and calling that real energy, or I don't want to be dealing with something in the world that's unjust, so I'm standing up, or I'm saying whatever. Those are important moments, but can we relish? Can we stay with that feeling, and still allow for the thing that has a hold to burn out of its own accord? Because again, when we want it to be over too quickly, we tend to get involved in a cycle. My spiritual teacher was talking about this recently as well, which is that we move from the desire for pleasure that's future oriented, and then after we have soaked up enough satisfaction with whatever we're pursuing and desiring, then we get sick of it, we spit it out, and we don't want it anymore, and then we renounce. Right? So if you've ever, for example, dealt with trying to get your diet or lifestyle under control, you may notice this pattern. I don't want to slam chocolate bars anymore. I renounce chocolate. I'm taking a sugar cleanse, 20 days. And then after the sugar cleanse, a couple weeks, you're like, yeah, now I'm like really healthy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm high on that. And then all of a sudden you swing back and you eat chocolate bars. It's because in some ways, it's specifically because we're not allowing ourselves to sit in the position of powerlessness long enough. We're underestimating the importance of what it means to be in a position where we know what's right, but we don't have the power, the strength, the will to overcome it in some literal sense. Because overcoming something really has to happen on the level of consciousness. And on the level of consciousness where we're always free, where we're always seated in our original identity, the first level of freedom comes in recognizing that I am already free from this vice, even though this vice might still have some clock to play out here. Because I know that this isn't the right thing to be doing, I'm already liberated. That's really hard to do because for us, we're so identified with the body that we can't imagine that just knowing that I shouldn't be eating so many chocolate bars is actually a form of liberation that is cultivating the real liberation. The fine line is, of course, one might sit there and say, well, I know I shouldn't eat them, but okay, I'll just keep eating them, right? And then enable one, and then one never stops. Like that would be a problem too. But that's not what we're talking about. We're simply talking about the position of, justice is being served. You know what you need to do. The leveling of the scales is happening, but there may be some element of powerlessness about it. So how do you sit in that experience? How do you let that experience, kind of percolate, right? Because if we allow that experience to percolate, then hexagram 55, abundance, which is also a picture of illumination, really understanding the root of an issue. We have to sit with it for a while. So we have to be careful of rushing off to resurrections and victories right now. For the entire paradigm to change, which is possible because the sun is moving through a conjunction with Uranus in the next few days, right on the heels of all of this, we have to be willing to look at the relative powerlessness that we might have to make the changes as immediately as we think they need to be made. We can't mistake the need for truth or justice for retribution or self-righteousness. We can't mistake the need to make a change with the immediate desire to taste the fruit of a change. Real change is deeply patient, and real change solidifies itself in places that occur before we can try to translate the change into material form. So these are things that are very deep teachings in the I Ching about this moment that I felt like, we should talk about today. So my last message is also simple, which is that as this comes through, I'm going to kind of talk out both sides of my mouth now and just say this. I don't think that you're going to have to wait too long. You know, in the grand scheme of things, I do see the energy that's coming through right now as an indication of um, uh, the ability to make great changes. And we may have to, you know, move through a period of feeling a little bit disempowered. Um, and I would only say be careful, because the the things that you feel most adamant about right now that need to change or that you have to address, the things you have to say, just be very careful, because we can place ourselves in a somewhat humiliating position if we don't recognize the degree of the degree of power or the degree of influence that we really have in the situation. It's very hard to let those, I'm learning for myself right now, it's very hard to let our realizations, our truth, our sense of what we need to do to sink down into a place deep within us before we necessarily act on it or see the fruits of it. So that's what I've got for you guys today. Well, let me look through some of the questions if there were any. Tower card vibes. Yeah, you've got that in the air from the Sun Uranus, I think. Yeah. Are there opportunities coming to redeem the old karma? How do we know how long to sit with the ashes, so to speak? Oh, yeah, that's a good question, Spencer. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of opportunities for redemption and opportunities to make important changes, especially the feeling of needing to kind of this kind of Mercury, Chiron, and Aries moment, like, you know, calling out the thing, whatever it is, this is the truth. Trying to be right now, like that first hexagram says, if you try to be the punisher and the administrator of justice, like it might be, you might be in the right, you might be in the right position, you might know the truth, but you may still be humiliated because you don't really have the power to do anything about it. Or you don't have, it's sort of like I said, it's sort of like my 3-year-old daughter trying to police my bad attitude. The power differential, she was in the right, and it was like, I was so proud of her, you know. But obviously the power differential put her in a humiliating position, which I then, you know, had to go back and help her build her confidence about later. But that's just a simple example, but that's kind of the position that we're all in right now. And how long to sit with the ashes? Until I think we feel resolved to allow for what is to still exist. So it's kind of like, you know, I know that I need to do something, but I don't have the power to do it. Okay, I'm just going to stick with knowing that I need to change it and continue to like patiently stick with the process that's playing out. You know, like I know I need to leave my job, but I can't leave it yet because it's not practical. Okay, well, instead of writing my boss a huge letter and quitting and like making my life unbearably difficult, I am going to stick with my intention. I see that my boss is corrupt. I see that there's a problem. I see that I need to leave, and it's not quite the time yet. So I'm going to sit with it peacefully and patiently, waiting for the right time. And then when the right time comes, you'll know. You'll know because your patience will be your guide. All right. Reminds me of the song Back to the High Life Again. He is going to be on top again, and all the old doors will open again, but we know it will never happen. It is a song about decline. Ah, nice. Let's see. 45 minutes, your talk about seeing something immoral or unjust, but not having power to do anything about it. To give you another example, let's look up yesterday's provincial election results for Alberta, Canada. Lots of people calling him out, even though we don't have any power. Yeah, there was an Onion article that came out talking about prosecuting Julian Assange will lead us on will put us on a slippery slope to where we already are. That was the name of the article, and I got a gut laugh out of it because yeah, there's that feeling of like feeling powerless to make the change that you know needs to be made. However, one of the things that the line says is there's no humiliation, or there's a little humiliation but no blame, which means it's not wrong right now to speak the truth, to call something out, to, you know, you may be called on to be a voice of karmic justice somehow, or you may be on the receiving end of it. you know. Um, there's but there's no, at the end of the day, there's no blame involved, because what you're seeing is the truth, you know. So that's why it says no blame. Like, if you know, like my daughter, like if I would have held that against her in some way, do you know what I mean? Like, that, how crappy would that have been? There's no blame in what she said to me. Do you know what I mean? That she was true. It was spot on what she said. So similarly, you know, we may speak the truth, and there may be no blame in the impulse that where it came from. So that there's something really sweet about that we have to stick to. There's an example that I want to read to you that's actually poignant in this regard. One of my favorite spiritual teachers, Hridayananda Das Goswami, he says, "Granted that within an endlessly cycling and recycling cosmic history, the notion of a final definitive end of violence is quite naive. Still, much good can be done in the world, and efforts to bring about that good should elicit our gratitude and not merely our dismay. To give an example, gardens must be perpetually weeded, but they are weeded, and there are many beautiful gardens in the world. The lack of a final once and for all weeding should not elicit our dismay when we see people caring for lovely gardens." Bhagavad Gita seems to teach this view in the famous verse from the 4th chapter, 7th verse, "Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati." The term yada yada acknowledges that a dharma, it means people ignoring duty in the world and doing bad things, let's say, is perpetual. But so should be our efforts to restore dharma, to restore right actions in the world. Gardens must ever be weeded. So similarly, there are times in our life where we've done something wrong, or someone else has done something wrong, and rather than you know, being dismayed that we don't have the power to correct it right away, or that we don't have the power to correct all problems in the world once and for all, Hridayananda Das Goswami is just saying, you know, we should go on weeding, grateful for the opportunity to know the difference between good and bad, you know. So, you know, that's why I said, like, the realization of truth can be there. You can try to do something, and it may not be perfect the way that you try to do it, or you may not be able to affect change immediately, or the people that you're trying to talk to may not be receptive to you, or something like that. It can be a little humiliating, but that doesn't mean that you should dismay. It's kind of like, just go on gladly gardening. We can't always solve all the problems in the world, but there are well-kept gardens in the world, and we should keep doing our best. So, let's see. I'm looking through some more of the questions. It's because we do not have the answers yet. I'm afraid I've lost whatever that was in reference to, Constanza. So thank you, but I'm not sure what part that was in reference to. Okay, great. Well, that looks like that was it for all of the questions and comments. Thank you, everybody, so much. I hope that this talk has been helpful, and that you know, you'll all share your reflections in this post, or on my social media feed in the next few days as we continue to post about this. Share your reflections about what the next week is like, and let's keep our eyes on everything together. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.